We tend to have wine with dinner. We built a fire pit, and it's a beautiful stones that were laid in the ground, and then there are a couple of chairs out there with some sheepskins on them. That is such a wonderful place to enjoy a glass of wine as the sun is setting and the air is crisp and our dog romping around and sometimes people coming over and gathering. But there's something really lovely about being outside and near the earth and taking in nature and enjoying a glass of wine.
I think a fire pit is so tribal too, so communal when you gather around, whether it's just two of you or with other friends.
It's also elemental. You actually have to make the fire. It's not like flipping a switch.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 211. How can wine and food bring back memories of more than just the wine and food itself? Why are so many family secrets associated with food and drink? And how has the publishing world changed, and what does that mean for up-and-coming writers? You'll hear those stories and tips in my chat with best-selling author Dani Shapiro, whose latest novel, Signal Fires, has been named one of the best books of 2022 by Time Magazine, The Washington Post, Amazon, and others. 3 of you in the U.S. are going to win a copy of her book. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com and let me know you want to win. I'll choose 3 people randomly. Now, a quick update on my upcoming memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. One of the biggest challenges with this book was to write it without thinking about the backlash that I'll face from a number of online trolls when it's published. Writing with an eye on social media is impossible. It's like trying to write and edit your work at the same time. The brain, or at least mine, can't do both at the same time, especially when the self-editing comes from a place of fear. Writing requires freedom of expression and an expansive feeling to create new connections and patterns of meaning without worrying about the implications. The time for editing is later, with a professional, after the words have made it to the page. This is also when a legal review of the manuscript calms remaining anxieties. Deep breath. Whew. All right, here's a review from Sharon Romany, a beta reader from Boothbay Harbor, Maine. Written with sharp wit and humor, I thoroughly enjoyed it. The author narrates her struggle through an unexpected divorce and the scrutiny she faced as a wine critic at the hands of the misogynist wine industry. Told with authenticity and vulnerability, you feel as if you're chatting with an old friend over a glass of wine. Make no mistake, this memoir isn't written with a woe is me mentality. It's written by an incredibly empowered woman to help other women who have been silenced by chauvinistic behavior to find their voice. Thank you, Natalie, for sharing your story. It's an important one and a must-read for all. Well, thank you, Sharon, for sharing your thoughts on the book. I've posted a link to a blog post called Diary of a Book Launch in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/211. This is also where I share more behind-the-scenes stories about taking this memoir from idea to publication. If you want a more intimate insider seat beside me on this journey, please let me know that you'd like to become a beta reader and get a sneak peek at the manuscript. Email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. Okay, on with the show. Dani Shapiro is the author of 11 books and the host and creator of the hit podcast Family Secrets, which really is terrific. Her most recent novel, Signal Fires, was named Best Book of 2022 by Time Magazine, The Washington Post, Amazon, and others, and it is a national bestseller. Her most recent memoir, Inheritance, which I also loved, was an instant New York Times bestseller and named Best Book of the Year of 2019 by Elle, Vanity Fair, Wired, and Real Simple. Dani's work has been published in 14 languages, and she's currently developing Signal Fires for its television adaptation. Dani also teaches workshops and retreats and is the co-founder of Siren Land Writers Conference in Italy, and she joins us now from her home in Connecticut. Welcome, Dani. It's so good to have you here with us.
Thank you, Natalie. It's great to be with you.
Awesome. So you've been busy. Your book tour is just winding up, but you're a trooper. You're here with us this evening, so thank you for that. Now, before we dive into Signal Fires, which I loved, I'm, of course, going to tease out the food and drink elements given the focus of this podcast, but tell us about your family meals when you were a child. Were they important?
They were important, and I love that question because it's so evocative of childhood. So I was raised in a very religious home, and so when I think of family meals, I think of the Sabbath, and it was an Orthodox Jewish family, so the Shabbat, Friday nights, Saturday lunches. They were evocative, but they were also tense. And so I particularly remember the Saturday lunches because everything had to be served cold because it was not within the belief system to, use electricity on the Sabbath. So everything was sort of cold brisket, cold peas, gefilte fish, which to this day, I never developed a taste for it. And of course, like usually a beautiful loaf of challah bread.
Unleavened, I would assume.
No, that's on Passover. Challah, it's that braided bread that you'll see that's
beautiful.
Actually quite delicious. Yeah. So I have very clear memories of those. And I was an only child, so it was me and my parents.
Excellent, me too.
The three of us.
Nice to meet an only brat.
Yeah.
Why were they tense?
I think they were tense because my parents did not agree on the religious belief system. My father was the one who was devout. My mother was a self-described atheist who had agreed to raise their children or child in that belief system, but it wasn't one that she believed in. So there was just a lot going on. There was a lot simmering beneath the surface always. And I was a very sensitive child, and I felt a lot of that. And I think a lot of things come out, family meals. It's where else do we gather? Really throughout our lives, where else do we gather with family, with extended family, other than around a table?
Exactly. And it's one of the few times in our busy lives with social media and jobs and everything else that we slow down, perhaps, to enjoy each other along with the food and drink. But yeah. And so was wine served at those meals?
The wine that was served, I don't think would make the cut. It was sweet Manischewitz. Do you know what that is?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. That's what I thought wine was for a while.
I'm so sorry.
As a child.
No, just kidding.
Yeah. It's a wonder that I did develop a taste for it because that would be the wine that was served, but it was really more for ceremonial purposes.
Sure. And do you have any favorite dishes? You've mentioned one that you don't have a taste for as of today, but was there anything your mother made or your father that you still love?
Yeah. My mother made a really wonderful brisket, just a really, really delicious, very tender brisket in, practically falling off, the shredding, falling off the fork kind of wonderful flavors. My father, I think, as was true with a lot of dads of that era, had one dish that was his specialty. And I loved that as well. And that was breakfast. It was what he called Novi eggs and onions. So it was Nova salmon and scrambled with eggs and with onions until the onions were caramelized. And I can taste that right now as I'm talking to you.
I can smell it. Thank you. That sounds wonderful. Oh my goodness. Do you make either of those dishes today yourself?
I do make a brisket, but usually holidays. I would say when I make a brisket, I probably have graduated, more likely to make a beef bourguignon or something in my crock pot or my slow cooker if I'm going to make a big sort of meaty dish that simmers for many hours. but once or twice a year, a brisket is just the thing.
Mm.
And then in terms of the Novia eggs and onions, my husband also has basically one specialty, and it also is a kind of very slow cooked eggs with he likes shallots with
Ah.
caramelized
Mm.
shallots and sometimes Nova in there as well. So that tradition has continued in our home, I would
Wow.
say.
Some good resonance between the two generations there, food-wise. Now, you mentioned in another interview that as you progress through the years, you're less likely to play it safe. You had a story in another interview about a bottle of olive oil that you brought home from Provence. What was it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
2 bottles,
Oh,
actually.
2.
It's very sad.
Oh, it's a sad olive oil story. Okay.
It's funny and
Yes.
instructive. So my husband and I spent our honeymoon in Provence, in Paris and Provence. And then toward the end of our honeymoon, we started buying things to bring home, some beautiful faience pottery, a few other things here and there, beautiful tablecloth. And we went to this very special olive farm and really extraordinary olive oil. It had had a big recommendation to us from a friend who knows Provence really well, how special this olive oil was. And this was still during a time where you could bring bottles on airplanes. So we very carefully packed and carried a shopping bag of this precious olive oil all the way back from Marseille to Paris to New York, home. And then we didn't open them because they were so precious that we just were saving them for the right moment. And I don't know how long we waited, but we waited too long. And when we did open that first bottle, of course, it had gone rancid, and both of them had gone rancid. And there was really a lesson in that.
Yes, absolutely. That happens with wine too. It's, whatever, carpe the bottle today. You can wait so long for that special occasion that you miss it, but it's so emblematic of life. It's like, make tonight or make today a special occasion with how you live it.
Exactly. I've become much more likely to say, let's open a nice bottle of wine tonight.
Yes.
You know, I mean, we have a wine cellar that has very much everyday bottles in it and very much sort of special bottles that, were gifts or, my husband has a very good memory for exactly where he has bought a bottle of
Oh,
wine.
good.
I don't have that gene, but I will just celebrate a wonderful Thursday night where we're home and it's snowing and the fire's going and we're feeling just like, yeah, carpe diem, absolutely.
Is there a particular bottle that you've had recently that stands out? One of those special bottles? Or was it more the night and maybe the label or the brand was even irrelevant or unmemorable?
Well, so often that is the case. I think that's when we travel, when we do our writers' conference in Italy, or also this was the case in Provence, the amazing feeling of just stumbling into some bistro or some trattoria and it's the house wine and it's so delicious. And some of its deliciousness is everything about the environment that you're in while you're enjoying it and the food and the ambiance and just the feeling of that moment in your life. But we did open recently a special bottle for absolutely no reason, and it was an Italian wine called Testi. And it has a history with us, which is that we were in Tuscany at a beautiful, very small boutique hotel villa. And this wine, Testi, is a nearby vineyard. And it's kind of like something out of the mind of, like a beautiful madman. I mean, the way that he harvests his grapes has something to do with the constellations and astrology. And
Yes.
there's some very fine wines that have come out of that vineyard. And so we have the occasional bottle of Testi, and it brings all of that back.
That's great. Yeah, he's probably perhaps a biodynamic farmer who looks for the alignment of the moon and the stars and burying bull's horns and all kinds of things. But even if you aren't a big believer in that, to me, it certainly says the winemaker is paying attention to the vines and the earth. Like anything that draws your attention closer to what you're doing is a good thing, perhaps. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, do you have an ideal setting for a glass of wine? I mean, do you and your husband generally have wine each day, or is it sort of a weekend thing?
We tend to have wine with dinner. The spot that comes to mind is during the early days of the pandemic when it just felt like we were going to be outside for a very, very long time if we ever wanted to socialize ever again. We built a fire pit, and it's a beautiful stone sort of, it's very organic looking, but it's not a neat little circle, but it's these stones that were laid in the ground, and then there are sort of half stone walls surrounding it, and we have a couple of chairs out there with some sheepskins on them and a fire pit. And that is such a wonderful place to enjoy a glass of wine as the sun is setting and the air is crisp. And I have some really, really happy memories of doing that, even just in this last period of time, and our dog romping around and sometimes people coming over and gathering. But there's something really lovely about being outside and near the earth and taking in nature and enjoying a glass of wine.
Absolutely. Yeah, under the stars. And I think a fire pit is so tribal too, so communal when you gather around, whether it's just two of you or with other friends. That's very evocative. And I just love the way you describe it. It's very much like you're writing. You've got an image here and an image there, and it does paint a picture in our minds, and we fill in the rest, but it's
Mm.
beautiful.
It's also elemental. There's something about you actually have to make the fire. And in our case, go gather the little bits of kindling. And a lot of our wood is stacked up on a hill and kind of, climb up the hill and bring down the logs and set it all up. And so you've earned something in that moment. You've worked for it a little bit.
Yes.
It's not like flipping a switch.
Absolutely. Well, I always think bodies in motion, that's, also a way of expressing time. I was a dancer as a younger woman, and I mean, we're going to get to that, but you experiment with time so beautifully. But, the whole gathering of the logs and the effort, as you say, makes it more worthwhile. But also, there's some motion there that brings it to a sort of crescendo or whatever, a spark, a signal fire, perhaps. Anyway, so which wine do you have with you today? I'd love to know what you are sipping on there.
I chose this especially for our conversation.
Excellent.
So this is a Cabernet from a vineyard in Healdsburg, California called Thumbprint.
Ah,
I love the label. It's actually on the bottle. And we discovered this wine while I was on book tour. I had a book tour stop in Northern California in Sonoma, in Healdsburg, which is quite a mecca for food and wine lovers, and it's such a special place. And I actually did an event in the tasting room. It was set up by a bookstore, but they wanted to do a special thing. And so they did it. The bookstore is called Copperfields, and they did it next door in the tasting room of Thumbprint Cellars. And I had never done a book event like it. It was really special. And we spent the night there. And the next day we went back and we spoke with the winemaker, heard a little bit more about the story of this vineyard. The thumbprint actually was a mistake. It came as he was starting to make his bottles. He accidentally ended up putting his thumbprint on a bottle, and it was so cool that it became Thumbprint Wines. But it's a really just earthy, delicious cab. And we had a case shipped home of any number of different wines from them. But again, it's the wine and it's the story of the wine.
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
I think of every bottle has a story, every label is just the first page or whatever, the cover, if you will,
Yeah.
until you dive in there. But I'm thrilled that you had an event at a winery, kind of like a Spines and Vines. I think reading and drinking wine go well together, perhaps up to a point. As long as you don't have too much wine, you fall asleep. But I think there's so many similarities. And Thumbprint, that sounds just like such an incredible label, kind of like associated with identity and, I don't know, discovery.
Yeah. I believe it was started by the young man that we were talking to, by his dad, and then he's taken it over, and then his partner is there, sort of working with him. And it just feels like it's a family business, which is also really nice to see.
It is, yeah. Many wineries are. We think of the big ones, the big labels that we all know, but the majority of wineries in the US and Canada are family owned. They're small operations. They're grape farms is what they are. And people think it's glamorous, but it's farming, fancied up farming, but farming.
Mm-hmm.
But have you since had that while you're having it now? Does it take you back? Do you feel like it takes you back there to that winery, just drinking it or smelling it?
I do. Drinking it or smelling it, both really.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm.
I mean, there's something that has, I mean, long since been true in literature, from Proust's Madeleine, on forward and backward,
Exactly.
of scents and tastes evoking emotion
Mhm,
and memory.
mhm.
And sometimes we don't even know in the moment what's being sparked, but something is being sparked.
Absolutely. Great, great verb, sparked. So the smell is our only sense, you probably know this, that is tied directly to the center of emotion and memory. All the other senses have to go through a more circuitous route in the brain. But that's why when we smell something like wine or Proust, when he was eating that, it was actually not the taste, but the smell of the Madeleine that would take him right back, perhaps to where he was in his childhood. And I think that's the magic of wine. It's like this sort of scent carpet that you can travel along back in time, looping time. And I know that I can be right back to where I tasted a wine for a first time. And it's weird. Sometimes I think it's just being a bit of a off-kilter wine savant, knowing that, what I was wearing, who I was with, what we were eating, where, all that sort of thing. But I think it's because of the power, especially aroma and smell.
That makes sense. And I actually did not know that about scent being the only sense that bypasses all that. But you say it, no, that makes perfect sense to me.
It goes right to the amygdala and the hippocampus, I think it is, and in the limbic system. And those are primal areas of the brain. And so that's why it is so strong and evocative. So, I'll smell a National Geographic magazine and I'll be back in my grandparents' kitchen because they
Yeah.
subscribe to that. I love the smell of the magazine. It's that more than anything else. I don't remember the pictures in the magazine, but I remember the smell of it.
Hmm.
And that's so powerful. Okay, so cool. And what would you pair with this wine, the Cabernet that you're having right now? Would it go with that brisket that you make?
It would go with the brisket.
Okay.
It's a wine that I think wants to be paired with a kind of meaty something that has a similar kind of like heft to it. Or it would pair with the brisket, it would pair with beef bourguignon, it would beautifully. Yeah. It would also pair well with a bird of some sort, with chicken, or I don't like turkey particularly, but it would be a good Thanksgiving wine.
Sure. Well, your intuition is right on there, Dani, because, often turkey is a bit of a dry meat. It certainly is if I cook it, which I don't. I try to stay cooking adjacent. But Cabernet has tannins, which are drying. They're those furry mouth feeling you get from eating walnuts or oversteeped tea. And so you put a dry bird with a dry drink, and it's not pleasant. So your brisket is right on. You want juicy kinds of meats with lots of protein. Well done.
Thank you.
So, do you remember the moment you knew that you wanted to be a writer?
It wasn't like there was a moment. I always wrote, but I did not know that it was possible to be a writer. I didn't grow up surrounded by writers or artists. I was that kid who read constantly and, stayed up late straining my eyes and reading under the covers with a flashlight. But I didn't know that a life as a writer was something that anybody did. I didn't connect these books that I loved with the idea that somebody actually spent their life writing them. And it wasn't really until I got to college that for the first time, I went to a school called Sarah Lawrence that's just north of New York City, an easy commute. And so there were a lot of working writers who were teaching there, who would come up once or twice a week. And the rest of the time, they were writing their books or their stories or their essays. And that was hugely revelatory for me. And so I think the first step was, oh, this is a possible life. I didn't think it was possible for me still, but I thought this is what it looks like for somebody to do this. The great American short story writer Grace Paley taught there, and she was a mentor of mine, and she modeled for me, this was a woman who was a mother and a wife and probably a grandmother at that point. She was a social activist. She was always getting arrested and classes were always getting canceled because Grace was doing her social activism. She was deeply passionate about life and she wrote these magnificent short stories and she was a wonderful teacher. And seeing that was remarkable, seeing that modeled for me, even though I don't think she was trying to model it. This just was who she was. But it wasn't really then. It was a few years later that I began to feel this sort of burning need to have this be what I did with my life. And that was a scary thing because I didn't know if I could or if it would work, or there's no safety net in becoming a writer. But I went to graduate school. I stayed at Sarah Lawrence for graduate school, and it was Grace Paley actually who said to me, "Sweetheart, you should go there. There's the door to the graduate program. Just go through that door. You belong there." And that's where I wrote my first novel.
That's uncommon to publish a novel while you're still in graduate school?
Yeah, it is uncommon. And I'm glad that that happened. But in a way, I wasn't really ready. The book wasn't really ready. And so, on the surface of things, I had this first book coming out with a major publisher, and I was written about in magazines and newspapers and stuff like that. And I went from being kind of a late bloomer to being precocious overnight because, it went from sort of what's Dani doing with her life to, oh, she's publishing a first novel at the age of 27. And it was good that it happened because it got me started. But I am always sort of encouraging young writers now, if they can, to find a way to slow down and have your first book as your first impression.
Yes.
And I now feel very thankful for the entire shape of my career, because the shape of my career has been like this. I've been in book after book, very much competing with myself, with I've done that, now what can I accomplish? But it began with sort of learning how to write a novel in public and bringing out that first book. But it was also really thrilling.
Yeah.
In Signal Fires, there's this line of change one thing and everything changes. And it's kind of a motto of mine in a way. It means something very different in Signal Fires. But in life, I can't really wish that that had been any different, because if that were different, everything that followed would have been different. And I wouldn't want everything that followed to be different.
That's true. Even the traumatic moments, they make us who we are.
They do, and they're part of the map.
They are, aren't they? A little bit of the butterfly effect. And just going back to something you said, that first novel is your first impression. And today, I'm glad you're urging writers to slow down, because today, there isn't a lot of forgiveness if that first novel doesn't work anymore, with big publishers at least. You've got to be.
No, I'm very aware of that, and maybe someday I will be able to write an essay about it, because what happened with me when I was 27 would be almost unheard of today. So I write a first novel, it comes out, it gets some nice attention, but it doesn't set the world on fire. I write a second novel that also comes out, gets some nice attention, but doesn't set the world on fire. I remember between my second and third novel, I was thinking about changing publishers, and I was at a big publisher, and the editor-in-chief of that publisher said to me, "Someday you are going to be a big best-selling writer, and I want to still publish you when that happens."
Wow.
That kind of thinking would not happen today. And it's unfortunate because there's such a sense of something needs to come out and explode and be noisy and be big. It's like be big or go home. It's really unfortunate because it was my fourth book, Slow Motion, my first memoir, when I really started to become known and really began to come into my own as a writer, or maybe the novel that I wrote before that. But it took me a while. It takes a while.
It does, to develop a career and a voice and all that other thing.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And to think that that might not have been possible, or I might have been discouraged, or, a writer today will often not be able to sell another book or have to move to a different kind of platform, to a smaller publisher or to self-publishing. And it's a very different world than it was when I was starting out.
It is. And sometimes you wonder how many voices we've lost because there wasn't that care for someone's career to let them flourish and develop, to hone their craft. But we're so glad you made it, Dani. Do you have a memorable worst moment of your writing career?
It's funny that you ask that, because just today, there was this very interesting thing that happened on Twitter, of all things, which is that a young writer with a first book coming out had a really unhappy experience where nobody showed up at a reading. And she was really feeling quite despairing. She thought that there were more RSVPs. She thought that people were really going to show up. It was going to be a crowded event. She was very excited. And I think 2 people showed up and she was devastated. And it's a very difficult thing when 2 people show up because they've shown up. So you still have to give a reading and a talk. You're talking to 2 people. And so she wrote on Twitter something like, this was really hard and this is what happened. And every writer in the world, it seemed, chimed in to say, that has happened to me. Everyone from Neil Gaiman to Margaret Atwood to Cheryl Strayed to Steve Martin, for God's sake. I mean, it just went viral. And there were just hundreds of us just saying, yeah, that happens. And so, I've had more than one, but mine was most notably in Northern California at a great bookstore. It was for one of my novels. And, my publisher had flown me out there. That was why I was there, was to give this reading. And there were 5 people in the audience, and they were surrounded by lots of folding chairs for the people that they were expecting to have come. And there was a young woman in the front row who was crying, I think because my work meant a lot to her. There was someone who had wandered in who probably was just trying to stay warm and just have a place to sit for a little bit. There was the bookstore manager, and there were my cousins. It all would have been fine if my cousins had not been there. But my elderly cousins who lived not far from the bookstore had come over there to, support me. And I could tell that they were sort of looking at each other like, she makes a living at this? It was so mortifying. And fortunately, a number of years later, any number of times I've been back at that same bookstore with big crowds, and the cousins have come back.
Oh, good. You are redeemed.
That really mattered to me, that the cousins came back and that they saw But there have been any number of moments like that. And I think part of, what is endemic to being a writer or an artist of any kind, or somebody who's entrepreneurial and is constantly making something where something did not exist, is to feel it, be miserable, and then go to sleep and wake up the next day and brush it off, shake it off, whatever it takes, and get back to work. And that really does separate those who, in the long run, have creative lives and pursuits and success, and those who don't. There's this great essay called Writing in the Cold, the First 10 Years, and it's by an editor who's no longer with us named Ted Solitaroff. And he was a great editor, a legend in his time. And he wrote this essay that was passed around when I was in graduate school, where he wondered about the very talented students he had and why had some disappeared and why had others flourished. And it wasn't always the ones he thought would. It wasn't always the ones who had the most fiery talent. And the word that he used, which I don't even think is in the dictionary, but I've never forgotten it, is that what separated those who did and those who didn't was endurability, the ability to endure.
Right.
And endurability is just the most wonderful word, I think, the most wonderful quality to be able to have in so many ways in life. And so I think of that when I think of those kinds of moments. A writer of a first book saying nobody showed up at my reading. Of course they didn't. Nobody knows you yet. It's okay. And this writer has just gotten a huge boost of support from, the whole universe just showered down on her. It's okay. And I wish everyone could have that, to know that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's so relevant to other fields too. The professionals just keep going. It's the Navy SEALs sitting in the cold ocean. It's like, just grit and grace and keep going. Keep going. Just keep going.
Yeah,
and
which
keep going.
doesn't mean don't feel. It doesn't mean don't acknowledge disappointment and wallow in it for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, it is the feeling of enduring and of continuing and maybe even of getting mad at it. And I know when I've had moments like that, I usually feel like, in a good way, a kind of I'll show them.
Yes,
I'm going to be better. I'm going to write an even better book next time.
exactly.
That's just been my way
Yes,
through life.
absolutely. Oh gosh, that's so resonant, Danny. Like, I mean, just in life, every time I heard a no, you can't do that, I leaned in with a harder yes. And sometimes I think if I had had faint praise, I would have given up. But because bump up against some of that, no, you can't, you go in harder with, oh, yeah, yes, I can.
Exactly.
Do you have a best moment of your writing career that comes to mind?
In recent years, there have been so many, and they've been different kinds of best moments. I would say that when Inheritance was published, I mean, a writer never knows what to expect. You can't know. You can have your hopes and dreams and worries, but you really don't know what's going to happen. And when Inheritance came out, it struck this chord. And part of it was that my story lined up with an important story. And I was in this moment in time, in this century, in this world of ours, the person who got to tell it. Because I had written 9 books and I had the tools in my toolbox. And I had written memoir and I knew a lot about what makes a story feel compelling and universal. And this was a story that happened to me. And I wanted to send the story back. I didn't want the story. I said to my husband, I want to send the story back to the story store. I want to pick another
Yeah.
story. But you don't get to send your stories back to the story store, not the stories of your life. And I wrote that book, which just very briefly for people who are watching or listening who don't know it, I had always written about secrets. I had always written about family secrets. And I discovered quite accidentally that I had been the family secret, that my dad, my beloved dad, maker of the Novi eggs and onions, had not been my biological father. And that my parents were both well aware of that because they used reproductive medicine and used a sperm donor and were told to never, ever tell anyone ever, ever again, and didn't.
Wow.
And took that secret to the grave with them. But then here I was in the middle of my life, taking a DNA test just for the fun of it, because my husband was doing that too, and making this really rather earth shaking discovery that spoke to so many different sort of aspects of my identity and my history and my nature and the very face staring back at me in the mirror, all of that.
Mm.
And so that discovery in 2016, which led to my writing Inheritance, which came out in 2019, when that book came out, the very first event that I walked into, which was in New York City, was wall to wall people.
Wow.
And I had experienced crowded readings before, and especially in New York City, which was sort of my hometown, nothing like this. I mean, people couldn't get in, the door was locked, they were at capacity. And I spoke and I read a little bit. And then it became clear that a lot of the people who had shown up were grappling with different kinds of secrets of their own. And it became like this kind of organic kind of group experience that I had not remotely anticipated. And that continued for a year. Everywhere I went, every city, I pretty much toured. I mean, I came home in between, but I toured nonstop for all of 2019 and even into 2020, right up until the pandemic stopped me. And what happened was, I mean, every writer hopes that there will be a purpose, but the purpose is very often fairly simple. It's connecting with readers, it's moving people, it's the one way that I don't mind making people cry. This actually felt like a purpose that was greater because people were reading my book, adoptees, people who had been conceived using donors, parents who had kept the secret from their children, hundreds of thousands of them. Like they were reading my book and it was changing their minds
Wow. That's so
about.
powerful.
So that, in every city I went to, there would be people coming up to me saying, my dad sat me down and told me that he wasn't my biological father. And he asked me to come tonight and say thank you to you because he really didn't understand that it was important and why it was
You
important
started all
until he
these
read it.
conversations.
I started all these conversations, and I had no idea that I was going to.
Wow.
My book is not political. It's a story, but I very much wanted to really walk the reader through the story of what does it mean to find out that you're not who you thought you were? And what does that mean on the level of identity? And what makes a family? And what makes a father? And what is familiarity and nature nurture? All of this. So this is a long way of answering you, but that period of time was so profound for me and really sort of life altering because I got to see the way that a book can make such a profound difference in a very dramatic way.
Wow. Now I know why that woman in the front row was crying. You know, you're touching on these big universal themes and questions, but in your story is so specific, so personal. I think that's how you get at it. I just, you told your story expecting it to just sort of land one way, but people made it their story because it just resonated with them. That I just love that book, Inheritance. I mean, my mom's doing DNA tests and telling me about odd cousins everywhere, but that must have been just so moving. It must feel like you've almost fulfilled your purpose on this planet. I mean, I know you're going to keep writing, but that must have been just so satisfying.
I did have a feeling of what if I had never discovered this? It would have been so easy for me to never discover this. And as a writer, I was always writing around. I mean, I'm proud of my previous books, but there was a way in which I was digging for something. I mean, why did I start writing memoirs? Why did I move? I mean, Signal Fires is my first novel in 15 years. Why had I moved away from fiction and in the direction of memoir? It wasn't a career decision. It wasn't an intellectual decision. It wasn't anything like that. It was an imperative. I was digging. I was searching. I didn't know for what, but there was something I didn't understand. And then, really randomly and quite by accident, suddenly I did. And that felt to me like, all right, this part of my life, this chapter of my life now feels really complete. The literary chapter, I mean, for the rest of my life, I will still be unpacking, that discovery in a way.
Sure.
But in terms of my memoirs, it felt to me like now when readers say to me, where should I begin? Do I begin with Inheritance and then move my way backward? Do I start with Slow Motion and move my way forward? It doesn't matter. It actually doesn't matter. They could be sold as a boxed set. I think there's a beauty in we can only know what we know at any given point in time. And so when someone writes a memoir, they're writing about what they know then, and they will know more later. And I always knew that, but I didn't know how much more I would know later. So there's a way in which that sense that I had that something didn't quite add up, if we go all the way back to the beginning of our conversation and those tense and unhappy childhood and, sitting at the dining room table. Oh, I should add a detail about the dining room table,
Sure.
may I?
Yes.
So it was a very special table. It was designed by Nakashima, who was a very big deal mid-century modern Japanese woodworker. And it was such a big deal and valuable table that you couldn't actually eat on the table. So there were mats. There were like thick, mats on top of the table. And then on top of the mats, which were there to protect the wood, would be a tablecloth.
Many layers.
Many layers. I mean, it's such a metaphor. But there was a lot going on all the way back then. There was stuff that I couldn't get at, that I didn't understand, that was between my parents. And so finally, as a writer and as a thinker, and as someone who I've been described as a public contemplative, I've contemplated publicly for years, which I prefer to the term memoirist, because I'm always just trying to make inquiries into things and using my own life as the way in, but not because I thought my own life was all that interesting, mostly because my life was what I had. So that was my tool of discovery.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's almost like, you've had this pattern, this arc of memoir, and you get to the end with Inheritance. Of course, there may be others, but it's almost like that optometrist when you go get the eye exam and they do the little click and just a slight.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. And all of a sudden everything's clear. It's like, oh, that's what I was trying to see.
Yes, I have described it exactly that way. Like suddenly having the right prescription glasses for the first time and not realizing that everything had been a little out of focus, a
Well,
little
and you
fuzzy.
don't know why, but something's not quite right. And then you finally get it. You see clearly face to face. Wow. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Dani. In the show notes, you'll find my email contact, the full transcript of my conversation with Dani, links to her website and books, and where you can find the live stream video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live every Wednesday at 7 p.m. You'll also find a link to my free Ultimate Guide to Wine and Food Pairing. That's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/211. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or want to win one of 3 copies of Dani Shapiro's new novel, or to be a beta reader of my new memoir at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. If you missed episode 22, go back and take a listen. I talk about writing my first book, Red, White, and Drunk All Over. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite. Wine has given me an excuse to be extremely nosy and to ask impertinent questions that I would never ask. I'm an introvert, which is great for writing, but I also need a crutch. And wine is my crutch, not just personally, but professionally. It allows me to go into people's homes, to sit at their family dining tables, and to ask really blunt and sometimes embarrassing questions. And so wine has taken me into places that I would never have access to, nor would my readers. And when I was on a book tour for my last book, they said, how on earth did you get into Domaine Romani Conti? It comes out on sale at about a couple $1,000s a bottle. It's not me who's getting access. It's the fact that I bring you, my readers, with me. They want to reach you. They can't accommodate all of you. So they let me in. And that's how I get to ask those juicy questions. If you liked this episode, please email or tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the tips and stories we shared. You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Dani. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a wine that brings back memories of eating and drinking around the family table. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.